Hello everyone, Professor Kusluch here. So today we're going to talk about three important themes in American democracy: civil liberties, civil rights, and contentious politics. So we covered civil liberties a bit in class, we covered contentious politics in class, we covered civil rights in class, and I just wanted to tie these three concepts together in a video for everybody today. So these three concepts are really at the foundations of how our democracy operates and evolves. So we know that civil liberties are the freedoms that protect us from government intrusions. Civil rights guarantee equal protection and equal treatment under the law. And contentious politics, protests, demonstrations, sit-ins, and more represent the ways that ordinary citizens can step outside of routine politics to demand change when the system is failing or when they have grievances with the government. So, put together, these three are important pieces of our democracy, of any democracy, and of how to change democracy when you don't have access to power. Throughout American history, we've seen contentious politics working to change our democracy. So, in many ways, civil liberties, civil rights, and contentious politics then work together. Civil liberties protect your right to protest. Protest often demands new civil rights, and then new civil rights, once won, expand and reinforce liberty. This cycle has really defined the American political experience from the founding era all the way to today, and continues to shape our American political system today. So let's take a look at all of these pieces in turn. Let's start with civil liberties, freedom from government intrusion. Civil liberties are what we call negative freedoms. They tell the government what it cannot do to you. The most obvious source of these freedoms is the Bill of Rights ratified in 1791. The first 10 amendments of the Constitution guarantee rights that we've heard about our entire lives, like the freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom of the press, the right to assemble and petition, the right to bear arms, protections against unreasonable searches and seizures, and the right to a fair trial. At first, though, these liberties applied only against the federal government. States could, and oftentimes did in the early days, trample rights freely. That changed slowly after the Civil War. With the 14th Amendment in 1868, the Constitution promised that no state could deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. Over the 20th century, the Supreme Court used that clause to apply most of the Bill of Rights to the states in a process known as selective incorporation. Today, nearly all of the Bill of Rights apply at both the state and federal level. But these liberties are not absolute, as we know and as we talked about in class. They are always balanced against other considerations. You cannot falsely shout fire in a crowded theater is oftentimes something we've heard since we were young kids of limitations on speech. You cannot threaten someone's life and claim it as free speech. You cannot threaten the lives of elected officials. So you see, there are some limitations. There are some bounds to these freedoms. The courts have recognized that liberty must coexist with order, safety, and the rights of others. Modern technology adds some complexity to this. When we think of, should AI-generated political ads be considered protected free speech? Should government be able to ban platforms like TikTok on national security grounds Or does that amount to censorship? Something that we're experiencing, we're talking and debating as a society right now. How to handle TikTok. Should there be government oversight on TikTok? Is there a national security concern that our information is being passed along to Chinese authorities? So we know that these ideas, these foundational principles in our Constitution are continuing to be debated and discussed today in our contemporary lives. We also see newspaper articles and news stories about should police be able to use facial recognition cameras without a warrant. Civil liberties questions like these are some of the most pressing issues of our time and really are what makes the front page of the New York Times or the Washington Post or the Wall Street Journal. We as a society are grappling with these ideas of, are there limitations? Should there be limitations? And then if there should and are limitations, where and how far do those limitations go? So the first part of our framework, civil liberties, gives us a zone of protection from government intrusion, but that protection means little if government treats different groups unequally. And that brings us to civil rights. Civil rights are these equal protections under the law. Civil rights are about fair and equal treatment by government, where civil liberties protect you from interference. Civil rights guarantee that you will be treated the same as others under the law. The foundation of civil rights is in the 14th Amendment's Equal Protection Clause, which promises that no state shall, quote, deny to a person within its jurisdiction the equal protection of the laws. But history shows that this promise has been honored, has broken down at times, this promise of equality has struggled at times. After the Civil War, Reconstruction raised hopes for equality, but Jim Crow segregation in the South kind of hindered those hopes. African Americans lived under systemic racism for nearly a century after emancipation. It took generations of activism to make civil rights real. African Americans fought tirelessly from abolition through Reconstruction, through the Civil Rights Movement and beyond. Cases like Brown versus Board of Education in 1954 ended legal school segregation. Protests and marches pressured Congress to pass the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965. Women pushed for equality from the 19th century suffrage movement through the fight for workplace rights and Title IX protection in education. Disability rights activists staged sit-ins and protests that led to the Americans with Disability Act in 1990. So the lesson is clear. Civil rights are never just handed down, they have been won throughout American history. Groups have mobilized, groups have protested, sued, voted, and lobbied to change laws, to bring about legislative changes. Civil rights are the product of these political struggles. So, for these political struggles, let's think about contentious politics. Really, democracy's emerging politics, democracy's less institutional politics. So, contentious politics is when ordinary people, who are often excluded from power, band together to challenge authority through disruptive action. It's not routine politics like voting or lobbying. It's politics that interrupt the status quo. Protests, marches, boycotts, sit-ins, and today we see digital activism. So these are things that we've heard about since we were young children, about ways that people that don't have power have banded together outside of conventional norms, outside of conventional levers of power to bring about change. When we've learned about the civil rights movement and we read about the civil rights movements, we've heard about protests and marches, boycotts, sit-ins. And as we said, like today, protests, contentious politics have evolved. Today we hear about digital activism. So protests may seem chaotic, but at its core, it is part of a democracy. It forces leaders to deal with injustices that they may otherwise have ignored. It brings attention to injustices. It brings attention to issues that matter to citizens. So we can take the civil rights movement as an example. The Montgomery bus boycott in 1955 lasted over a year and ended and led to the end of segregation on city buses. The Greensboro sit-ins of the 1960 spread to more than 100 cities, forcing integration of lunch counters. The Freedom Riders of 1961 challenged segregation on interstate buses, sparking violent backlash but also federal enforcement. In the Birmingham campaign of 1963, brought to life police brutality against peaceful protesters, shocking the conscience of the nation, bringing attention to these issues. So none of these victories happened because leaders simply chose to act. They happened because contentious politics made inaction impossible. So when we think of the civil rights movement, we think of these actions. Again, since we were kids, we've read about these actions in our textbook. We've seen pictures of boycotts. We've seen pictures of lunch counters in the South. And these activists, these individuals are engaging in contentious politics. So at times, protests are disruptive, but they are disruptive by design. And it sometimes does provoke backlash. So we can think about where civil liberties, civil rights, and just protests interact and intersect. So it is important to see how civil liberties, civil rights, and contentious politics fit together. So we know that civil liberties protect the rights to protest, free speech, assembly, and petition. Civil rights are often the very goals of protest movements. And when our textbook, when we're reading about civil liberties and civil rights, we know and we see that contentious politics were used as a way to bring about change. And these contentious politics are the process by which rights are written on paper become real in practice because people demanded change, demanded an expansion of rights. So this is a cycle. Liberties enable protests, protests demand rights, and then these rights demand liberties. And then the cycle repeats with new groups and new issues. So just to conclude and finish this brief discussion, democracy isn't just ballots in court cases. It's also marches, sit-ins, what we see now with like hashtag online activism, and the courage of people who refuse to be silent. So I just wanted to conclude with online activism, which is really what we see a lot of activism today. Sure, we see protests for the administration, against the administration. We saw this during the Biden administration, people advocating for, people criticizing the Biden team. Now we see it with Trump because he's in power. So we do see protests, we see demonstrations. We've seen this throughout American history. Now we see that many people take activism online. And there's a question about, is online activism, does that bring about the same amount of change as in person, the same movement tactics that were used during the civil rights movement? And I'm going to make a separate video on that because that is an interesting question and something that's interesting for us to think about. So if you made it to the end, thank you. A brief overview of civil liberties, civil rights, and contentious politics' role in that process. So thank you.